Hello students, Mr. John here. Welcome to Chapter 17, Lesson 1. It's sort of an overview-like lesson. It's called The Two Sides. So today's lesson is kind of like hopping in the shallow end of the pool, except it's the Civil War. Now there's nothing too specific in today's lesson. It's sort of an overview. What were the strengths of each side? What were the weaknesses? What were their goals? How did they plan on winning? And what was it like to be a soldier in this era of history? These are all questions we'll answer today, and tomorrow we start talking about specifics, like sort of going through the linear progression of the Civil War. So let's get into it. So the United States has found itself in a pretty bad position. The country was at war with itself. When it's all said and done, 600,000 Americans would die, and many more would be wounded. So, for most states, the decision to be Union or Confederate was pretty easy. So where are you at? Are you in the North or are you in the South? But what about the states right in the middle? This was the case of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. They were what's called the border states. Look on the map below and you can see why they were called the border states. Yeah, right there, sort of wedged between your North and your South. Now, the border states were essential to the Union. They served as a buffer between the Union and the Confederacy, and provided control of numerous waterways. They just had a lot of strategic value. Washington, D.C. is actually inside of Maryland, so had Maryland succeeded, the Union capital, Washington, D.C. would quite literally have been surrounded by enemy territory. Now, the border states were all actually slave states, so why didn't they secede? Well, they had strong ties to the North and the South, and they were slave states, but slavery wasn't as prevalent in these northern of the southern states. And Lincoln worked hard to keep them in the Union for all the reasons we talked about above. So even though they did not secede, there were many supporters of the Confederacy within the border states. For example, Baltimore had to be placed under martial law. There was a big riot in Baltimore in 1861, and there's a picture down here. So a lot of Confederate sympathy in the border states, but they did not secede and join the Confederacy. Now, each side had its strengths and weaknesses. If I had been around at the time, I would say the war probably could have gone either way. The North, I think I would have picked the North, and here's why. North had some big advantages. They had a lot more people. They had most of the industry in the country. We mentioned that a lot of the rail line was laid in the North, and the North had a navy, a big navy, and the South just didn't. But the South had some big advantages as well. For example, they had excellent military commanders. Oh, get them on the camera. I have plastic Civil War men. So they had excellent military commanders, and they had more skin in the game. They felt like they were fighting for their way of life. They were the ones, after all, that did secede. Their hearts were in it. Whereas the North was fighting to bring them back. They were fighting to be free. A lot of them saw it as a Southern war for independence. And most of the fighting ended up being fought on Southern turf, giving the Confederacy the home field advantage, which they often used to full effect. If we remember anything from the American Revolution, it was that home field advantage could be a game changer. Now, goals. When you get down to it, the South had an overall goal that would be much easier to accomplish. They were on the defensive. So all they had to do was defend their turf from the Union so they could continue to exist as a confederacy, an independent confederacy. They thought if they fought hard enough and long enough, the North would just give up. That was their plan. The North, on the other hand, had a pretty tall order to fill, and they wanted to restore the Union, and that means they had to invade the South, dismantle the Confederacy, and force them back in the Union, basically through conquest. So that's a lot. In terms of strategy, the South strategy was to hold out until the North gave up, but there was a little more to it than that. You see, European countries like France and England relied on imports of southern cotton, so their economies would suffer. And the Confederacy was hoping that places like Britain and France would pressure the North into letting the South just be and ending their war. In the North, it was a little more complex. General Winfield Scott made a 3-point plan called the Anaconda Plan, called such because the idea would be to, oh, here's my Confederate man, pressure and squeeze the Confederacy into submission, just like an anaconda snake would. 3-step plan. Step 1, blockade the ports. Step 2, cut the South in half by taking control of the entire Mississippi River, and then take the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Now, one truly tragic point of the Civil War was the fact that it was deeply personal. Families were split, brother versus brother. It happened. For example, Lincoln's own wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had family members in the Confederate Army. Families were literally split, with them breaking. Some side fighting for the North and some fighting for the South. Now, at the onset of the war, men on both sides were eager to enlist. Some were patriots. They thought they were doing the right thing for their country, be it Union or Confederacy. Some enlisted because everyone else was enlisting. They didn't want them to think that they were cowards. Well, some just wanted some excitement. I remember there were a lot of farmers in rural places. Even in the North, a good deal of the population was farmers. Now, the average age of a soldier during the Civil War was in the mid-20s, but like all wars, boys ran away from home and then lied about their age to enlist. Some of them were under 14 years old. I mean, that's like your guys' age. Can you imagine fighting a war right now? Pretty crazy. As I did mention, over half the soldiers in both armies were farmers. Now, African Americans were initially not allowed to enlist. Even in the Union, they were allowed to serve in the Union a few years later in the war, and we'll learn about the black regiments of the Union Army in later lessons. There are a couple regiments in distinction. I think we talked specifically about one. But we'll get there. In the South, they never ended up having basically slave soldiers. They didn't want to arm the slaves, have large bodies of armed slaves. That was probably a good idea on their part, and they didn't even consider it until the war was drawing to an end. They basically already lost. Now, by the summer of 1861, the Union Army, that's here, the blue guy, the Union Army had swelled to 187,000 soldiers. They were known as Yankees. In the South, the Confederate Army had about 112,000 soldiers, or rebels. So you had the Union Yankees, Confederate rebels. By the war's end, over 2 million men served in the Union, with 200,000 of them being African Americans. And the Confederate Army would max out at 900,000. Because you can see by the war's end, the Union had over twice as many soldiers as the Confederacy. Now, the life of a soldier, as a veteran, I can tell you that some things just never change. There's this romanticized life of a soldier with honor and duty and sing songs around the campfire and all that jazz. But it can, in fact, be pretty dull. You drill, you eat crappy food. You drill again, guard duty. Rain, more drill, rain again. You get my point. Back then, though, the food was worse. And there was a lot more sickness. I think in some cases more men died of sickness than of actual wounds in battle. Medical technology was just not what it is now. You could probably read a whole book, undoubtedly, on the medicine and surgery of the time and how terrible it was. There were a lot of amputations. The horrors of war, the screams of the dead and dying after a large battle, between that and the monotony of a soldier's life, well, it was too much for some. Desertion was a problem for both sides. I believe 1 in every 11 Union soldiers deserted, and 1 in every 8 Confederate soldiers, just because it was either terrible, or they were scared, or something like that. So that's it for today. You have a 10-point quiz on the next page. If you have any questions, let me know. This was a long lesson, and tomorrow's will be long too. Of special note, in the text on page 547, The next, it is the last page. There's a picture of a tank right there. And it says it's an artillery piece, and it's not. The Abrams main battle tank is not a piece of artillery. As a tanker, I had to point that out. Alright, have a good one.